A couple of games were released this year, and I didn't have a ton to say about each one, but I still wanted to talk about them. So let's go ahead and do that. First on the block is Cozy Grove, a cute little life sim game that's light on the sim and exceptionally light on the life. 'Cause, everyone in it's dead. Well, except for you. You play as a spirit scout, basically a Girl Scout who dabbles in lighthearted exorcisms, who winds up on a little island inhabited entirely by dead people. Bears. Seagull bears. Bear gulls? And tree bears. Basically, bears. But instead of grabbing your nearest rosary and exercising the bagel over here, you get merit badges for helping out the uninhabitants of Cozy Grove with their problems, which usually just entail bringing them things they want that are like 10 feet away from them. It's simple but effective, and with the overall cozy atmosphere, I see what they did there, and the gorgeous art style, it's a very cute game. But it is also not a very engaging one. This is a time-gated game, meaning that you can only do so much in-game during each real-world day. And gameplay-wise, it has a striking resemblance to Farmville and other Facebook spawn that tried to ape that style of addictive clicker game. You can only do one mission per character per day, you can only harvest so many resources, etc. This means progress is often very slow and you will run out of things to actively do very quickly. My first day session lasted a little under 40 minutes before I did everything I could and had to wait until the next day. That's not to say that this is a bad game by any means. The world is very nicely built and established despite its limited setting, and the characters are actually quite engaging with very interesting stories to uncover. That said, this is either going to be a game that you fall in love with and want to check back in on for a little bit each day over a long period of time, or it's a game that's going to end up boring you very quickly and you'll drop it. I don't really see a lot of in between here. It's too simple and sessions are too short for it to really scratch the itch of most life sim fans. But if you just want something that's super easy to pick up for an hour or less every day, that just makes you feel comfy and relaxed, then this is the perfect game for you. Unfortunately, it wasn't the perfect game for me. I played it for about a week and dropped off completely. Mileage will definitely vary on this one. On to the next. A game that did connect with me was Wildermyth, a tactical turn-based RPG that's basically what happens when an XCOM squad plays D&D during their downtime. Combat is grid-based, with you moving characters around the map, trying to get them into strategic positions to take on an ever-increasing amount of enemies, before you inevitably cock up and send a unit one square too far, getting them horribly maimed by some monster that you could have sworn was on the other side of the map, but that's XCOM Wildermyth, baby. The RPG element here is admittedly light at first, with your characters being a couple of randos who you can customize if having your friends get mauled by a rampaging stove is how you get your jollies, and the starting classes are typical fantasy fare. You got your warrior, ranger, and wizard, the vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry of the RPG world. But just like ice cream is best when you start adding toppings to make a sundae, Wildermyth really takes off when the customization starts to kick in. The game's story is procedurally generated, and most events are determined by chance percentages. So you'll not only never have exactly the same story even when choosing the same scenarios, but you'll never actually know what might happen. So instead of adding your own toppings to the sundae, it's a little more like trusting your drunk friend to add whatever they want to your ice cream and praying it all works out. This is what makes the customization so enjoyable. Sure, you can make decisions like who gets what equipment and who can attempt to sway outcomes, but ultimately what happens to your character and their limbs can come down to a toss of the dice. Will two characters fall in love? Will another two start a rivalry? Will a character event lead to one of them losing an eye? Will your son make a pact with a wolf spirit and become a furry? At least in my case, the answer to all those questions was yes. And that's just in one game. Sure, you could play around with the options a little to try to limit the randomness of certain things, but I feel that defeats the purpose. Wildermyth is at its best when things just happen, and you just have to roll with the punches, even if those things are horrible. And one of my favorite things about these random events is that they well and truly do persist for countless games. As once you finish a campaign, the characters that were involved become legacy characters, and thus can be brought into either new campaigns through recruitment, or band together with other legacy characters for a more challenging legacy campaign. So in short, Wildermyth seems simple on the surface, but gives a truly tremendous amount of options for customization. My only issue with this game is that due to its procedural nature, it can start to feel repetitive fairly quickly, as some events will repeat, and the core gameplay loop largely boils down to going to areas to uncover them, an event, and typically a fight. Fortunately, mod support for this game is absolutely fantastic, and you can easily pick up some mods that will help keep Wildermyth feeling fresh for countless, bizarrely mutated generations. I highly recommend people at least check this one out. And now for the tonal whiplash of the year, Chernobylite. What happens when you mix together elements from Fallout 4, Stalker, and the Metro series? You get Chernobylite. A dark, tense, and exceptionally Slavic game that takes place throughout Pripyat and the rest of the Chernobyl exclusion zone 3 decades after the infamous disaster. This is a first-person survival horror game, so it involves a lot of slowly sneaking around, picking off enemies, and gathering supplies. These supplies are used to feed you and your teammates, keeping up morale and effectiveness, and to build up your base of operations so you can become more efficient at survival and craft better gear and items. All in all, I really like this game. The atmosphere is bleak, with most of the moments of levity coming from the type of dark humor that is so quintessentially Eastern European, and the horror elements are some of the most affecting that I've encountered in a long while. I can only remember encountering one jump scare, and it wasn't even a cheapo, loud sudden noise equals scary affair like you get in most movies and games. It was actually handled really well, with proper build-up and payoff, which just doesn't happen in horror media most of the time. Paradoxically, the horror elements are both my favorite and least favorite part of the game. You see, after the first few hours or so, Chernobylite just stops being a horror game altogether. In fact, if you are either playing on normal or even hard difficulty and are smart about your resources, it stops being a survival game too. The majority of this game's best elements are severely front-loaded, with all the best scares and challenging gameplay hitting right out of the gate, and then petering out rather quickly. By the mid-game, I was no longer experiencing moments of horror, as I had already gotten all the scripted scares out of the way. And since there's only 5 semi-open levels to explore, I became familiar enough with the playing area to not even get caught off guard by enemies or anything. And since the loss of resources is the only actual punishment for a fail state, I never really felt threatened once I reached the point where I had 4 cabinets filled to the brim with ammo and supplies. This means that the horror elements that were so strongly present in the first few hours became the best parts of the game. So by the midpoint, I could only really look back on them and see that the best parts were behind me. So at least in my case, the latter half of the game really only compelled me to keep playing to see the plot and the stories of my companion characters to their conclusion. And for what it's worth, I really enjoyed all that. The plot is full of twists, turns, and decisions that you are able to rearrange by sacrificing some resources once you've hit a certain point in the narrative. And it's a fun ride all the way to the end. Unfortunately, I just can't say the same for the gameplay itself. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying anything about the gameplay is bad. Everything worked as intended for me. The environments were beautifully engineered and fun to explore, and the combat was always engaging and challenging, but things just kinda started to drag after a while. I would say this game suffers from a bit of a Super Mario 64 problem. Bet you didn't expect that comparison here. See, once you've seen all the side events, met all the vendors, seen all the scares, gotten all the clue documents, you don't really have anything else to do in an area. And you can only tackle one mission in an area at a time, and only go to one area per day. So over time, the game devolves into you jumping into an area, doing one mission, leaving, using resources as you transition to the next day, and then repeating until you've done everything you need to do to prepare for the final mission. It feels very reminiscent of getting booted out of a level after every star you collect in Super Mario 64. Sure, you're completing objectives and advancing your progress, but it can feel like a limitation that just drags down pacing. I think this game could really benefit from just a little more or just a little less. Meaning either a little more scares or tension or reasons to explore in the latter half of the game, or a little less length. Not necessarily a removal of content per se, but more like streamlining so it doesn't feel like it's wasting your time. But again, when all's said and done, I really liked this game, and I would love to recommend it to anyone and everyone. Sadly, I know this won't be everyone's cup of tea. So if you're looking for a big expansive world to explore, a scare-a-minute experience, or a survival crafting management sim, look elsewhere. But if you want a little bit of all that with a dash of weird temporal manipulation and post-Soviet depressionism, then I cannot recommend Chernobylite enough. Just maybe bump up the difficulty so you can ride that tension high for as long as you can. So those were a few games I wanted to talk about. They've all got their ups and downs, but hey, maybe I've piqued your interest in one or two, or killed your enthusiasm for all three. These were just sort of my free-form opinions on these games, and since no game is actually finished anymore until the fat development studio sings, it's very possible that some changes will be made to the games discussed here in the future, or even by the time I get this video out. So don't let my word alone be the be-all, end-all, and maybe check these out if you're so inclined. Well, that was fun and a little bit different. Hope you enjoyed yourself, and I hope to talk more about games and such in the future. Couldn't think of an end gag for this and didn't really know how else to end a video. So I'll just say...
Bye.